Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this edition of UTI's Monthly Market Insight. Um, the last 2 months, of course, have seen the festival season being celebrated across large parts of the country. And after a pandemic, which, of course, it's not that it has gone away, but which actually brought all celebrations to a halt for nearly 18 months, I'm sure many of you were able to enjoy this festival season with friends, family, and your loved ones. But of course, the pandemic, as I said, has not gone away. So please do continue to exercise all safety protocols to the extent possible. Thankfully, the vaccinations and all the other protocols that we have adopted have allowed India to sort of come through this difficult period fairly well. We have now a landmark number of vaccinations which have happened, and hopefully by the end of December, nearly 70% of the target adult population would be fully vaccinated. Today, in this edition, joining me is my colleague and fund manager, Vishal Chopra. He's been with UTI for several years now, started his career as an analyst with us. He's covered several sectors, particularly the consumer sector, but he's also tracked the telecom and cement sector among the other sectors that he's looked at. And about 3 years ago now, he started his fund management journey, becoming co-manager of our consumption fund. And today he is also the co-manager, as he has been for nearly 2 years, of our ELSS fund, long-term equity fund, and the two children's funds that we run, which are these solution-oriented schemes. So he'll be talking later about these strategies and how he really thinks about his investment approach. But today, we also have one new dimension to today's conversation, which is that we have a poll, and I think you will be able to see the questions of this poll being asked on the screen, I think at approximately 10-minute intervals. So we invite and request you to participate in the poll to the fullest extent. It'll be interesting to see, and we'll certainly share the responses of the poll so that you can get an understanding of what a large number of people on today's events tend to sort of believe or think about certain events which are related to markets and also to investing. So do participate in the poll when you see those questions coming up on the screen. As we normally do, we'll be showing a presentation on the screen, and my colleague Niranjan from the product team will be pulling up those slides on the screen. So I'm going to request him to bring that up on the screen now. And once that's on the screen, we can get underway. Yes, I think we've got the slides up there. So yes, that's Vishal Chopra that you can see on that cover slide along with me. Moving on without any further ado to some of the highlights of what we'll be talking about today. So Niranjan, if you can move to the next slide. Right. So these are some of the highlights that we'll talk about in this current edition. And of course, after that, we'll run through the normal slides on valuation and earnings, because no conversation about investing is complete without a discussion on where we are in the earnings cycle and where we are in terms of valuations. So we'll just move on now to the first slide. And this is an interesting slide because it shows you a term which has now come to be used quite commonly, which is excess savings. Now, you might pause here to ask, what is the meaning of excess savings? So what this data really reflects is that if you go back to the pre-pandemic period, which is the first quarter of 2020 calendar year, what happened is that in some cases, people were still earning an income, but they were unable to spend it fully because, remember, most of us across the world were in some kind of a lockdown, and most of our expenditure covered only our basic expenses. And then, particularly in the developed world, remember that the fiscal purse strings were opened quite dramatically. large-scale transfers were made to households and also to businesses in some cases. So therefore, these households and businesses received income from the government. The mirror image of that is the fiscal deficit of the government. But particularly in the household sector, the developed world was at the forefront of transferring resources to the household sector. So as a result of that, when you look at the period going back to first quarter of 2020 to date, what you see is that the household sector actually has ended up accumulating significantly higher amount of money as savings compared to what it would have traditionally done in the past. So what this chart really shows you is the excess savings which have happened compared to the trend. Now, as you're aware, in India, our ability to spend was also quite limited because of our pre-existing fiscal deficit. So yes, there was an expansion, but that expansion reflects more a reduction in tax revenues rather than large-scale transfers to households. And of course, there are other sort of credit-related schemes which were provided by the fiscal. So which is why India's line is right there at the bottom. But the developed world, US, Japan, UK, European zone, Canada, Australia, you can see anywhere between 7% to 20% of personal disposable income was the excess savings that they ended up accumulating during this period, either because income was in excess of expenditure, they could not spend because of the lockdown, and because of the large transfers which happened from the fiscal to the households. Now, therefore, unlike most recessions, this time around, household savings have actually gone up very dramatically. What has been the result of this unexpected outcome of what we would typically expect in a recession is something that I'll show you on the next slide. If we can just move there, Niranjan. This will show you the spending pattern as it has emerged. And of course, the best data that we have is for the US. So the data that you see here is for the US economy. And this shows you the US consumer spending on goods. Right now, if you look at this, you can see the trend line going back all the way to 2010. The dark blue line is the actual spend, and the dotted blue line that you see is the trend line. And look what happens during the pandemic. Of course, first there is a negative impact on consumer spending, but then as you come out of the pandemic, the spending actually surges way above the trend line. As you can see over there, from below trend line, it has literally gone to an equivalent number or higher on the other side of the trend line. So again, this is a very unexpected outcome relative to a classic recession, which is coming out of the recession because of the excess savings that households built up. They were able to spend very aggressively. Of course, what this chart shows you is only the spending on goods. Remember, people were not able to spend on services. They couldn't go to restaurants, they couldn't go to the movies, they couldn't travel, go on holidays, take an aeroplane. And therefore, some of that savings also shifted into spending on goods. Maybe they bought a new music system, they bought a home theater, so on and so forth. And that is why this huge surge in consumer spending on goods, way above the trend line. But for the first time, there are some signs that it is starting to now gradually normalize, but it's still a long way to go from normalization. So this is one of the unexpected outcomes of the pandemic, not like a typical recession. Even though economic output contracted, household savings went up, and those household savings went up because of money they couldn't spend and also fiscal transfers, and resulted in a boom in consumer spending. If you move on from here to the next slide, here what I'm going to talk about is something very different, which is the supply chain. Now, remember, one of the things that we've now discussed several times over the last few weeks and months is the disruption to the supply chain, which means consumers and businesses started to re-engage, consumer demand started to come back. But in most cases, the production system, because the production system is a lot more fragmented, it is a lot more globally interconnected, started experiencing bottlenecks. And because of those bottlenecks, we saw strange kind of outcomes. Many of you are aware it's very difficult to get a car today in India simply because there is a semiconductor shortage. Similarly, the cost of transporting goods went through the roof. So if you look at the left-hand side, the Baltic Dry Index, this is the cost of transporting goods. And look at that chart. It obviously collapses in 2020 in the pandemic period, but then zooms to levels that we have not seen in almost a decade. But now, gradually, we are seeing a downward trend start to kick in, and I'll show some more of this data in the next slide. The global container freight index, still not really turned down. Slight signs of running out of steam at the top, which suggests that gradually things are starting to normalize, but it's a slow and gradual process. So it's visible in the Baltic Dry, but not in the container freight index. Remember, container freight index typically relates to the manufactured goods which moves in containers, whereas the Baltic Dry is more about bulk materials. It could be cement, it could be fertilizer, it could be iron ore, so on and so forth. So this supply chain disruption, there are some early signs that it is starting to normalize, and we can see signs of this if we move, Niranjan, to the next slide. So what I have on this slide is some of the swings that we have seen in commodity prices. The light blue line is the price of lumber, or in other words, the price of wood. This is not a number that we track very closely in India, but in the US, lumber is more indicative of housing demand, housing construction than even cement. Because remember, in the US, most housing construction is wood-based rather than being cement-based. So you can see the light blue line of lumber, how it sort of surges in the period post-November 2020 to a massive new high in April, May 2020, where they said you can't build houses because there isn't wood available. But subsequent to that, as the supply chain disruptions have eased, there's been a dramatic collapse in lumber prices, still slightly above where we were in February 20, but only marginally higher. The darker blue line that you see is iron ore. Again, starting from a price of something like about $50 a ton, it surged in the same April-May period to almost $250 a ton for iron ore. But since then, prices have dropped by almost about 50%, and currently they are back below $100 a ton. Is it above the price of March 20 or February 20? Answer is yes. But those unusual spike that we saw has now significantly corrected as the supply has come back on stream. The red line is crude oil, which is, of course, the most painful one from an Indian perspective, because we are dependent on imports for crude oil. Now, in that case, the surge is not that dramatic. Of course, there was a period in April 2020, when you look at the left side of that chart, when crude oil prices went negative. It could have been, it wasn't so long ago. But if you look at the starting point, crude oil prices were about $50 in February 20. Then they went negative. From there, it's been a dramatic climb up, but it's up only to about $84, $85. And this is one commodity which is yet to correct. But when you look at the wild swings that you've seen in some of the other commodities, there is some reason to believe that some normalization may even happen in crude oil going forward as the supply chain is able to fully re-engage. So the point I'm making is that yes, there have been wild swings in commodity prices because of the supply chain disruptions, but we have seen a few commodities where things have started to cool down, and hopefully that will be the trend that we see in some of the other commodities where prices are still high, like crude oil, like natural gas, and that should give the world as whole some relief, both from cost pressures as well as inflation. Moving on to the next slide. Here we are actually going to talk about inflation, but with a slightly different context. Why do I say different context? Is that the classic way we think about inflation is about, one way is about the cost push, The other way is to think about the supply of money, because more the supply of money, it chases goods, and when it chases goods and tries to buy goods, it creates inflation. So what you see here are two lines. The blue line is world currency in circulation, and the red line is the global consumer price index, and there is a 4-month lag between these two. But you can broadly see that once we correct for the 4-month lag, these two are directionally, they tend to move in the same direction, which means when money supply goes up, inflation goes up, and when money supply goes down, inflation goes down. But there is a lag of 4 months between circulation going down and CPI starting to turn down. As you can move to that right-hand extreme, what you can see is that currency in circulation has now started to move lower, and therefore there is some reason to believe, not just from supply chains gradually, sort of normalizing, but also from currency circulation starting to normalize, that therefore inflation also might start to see a leg down. So hopefully, global inflation follows the drop in currency in circulation, again providing some relief. Moving on to the next slide very quickly. As you are aware, one of the challenges for CPI inflation in India has been the continuous increase in petrol and diesel prices, and their contribution to CPI is limited. The bigger contribution comes from the calculation of transport cost. But as you can see here, at the peak, almost about 80 or 90 basis points was the contribution of the increase in fuel prices to CPI. Even today, it's at about 60, 70 basis points. But Government of India recently cut the taxes on fuel, and this should allow potentially inflation CPI, if it's fully transmitted, to come down by about 30 basis points. So that's an estimate, but based on the 10 rupee drop, that is what one could potentially expect. So this could potentially give some relief on the inflation front. So these are some of the broad, macro themes that we thought it would be interesting to highlight today. With that out of the way, we'll just quickly run through our normal set of slides. First, we can move to the next slide. This talks about earnings growth. And as you can see over there, the earnings growth for March 22 expected at 36% year on year. Of course, we are now in the second quarter of FY22. Earnings have pretty much been in line with estimates, maybe slightly better. We can see that on the next slide if we move to that. Right. So if you look at the right-hand side over there, the yellow line is the line for earnings of FY22. The line above that, the slightly light blue, is the line for FY23. And while it's very early days, the earnings for FY24 are in the highest line on the right side. As you can see, the earnings line for FY22, the yellow line, there was some correction during the second wave in the May-June period, but after that, it has been remarkably stable. And as earnings have come for the second quarter of FY22, while earnings forecasts for the full year have been unchanged, there has been some upward trajectory in that light blue line for FY23. So there's been a slight uptick in FY23, stability in FY22. So taking these earnings growth numbers, even though these are estimates, what does it look like when we look at valuations based on the Bloomberg consensus numbers? You can see this in this slide. Yes, of course, as we saw on the previous slide, earnings growth for India has been fantastic. It's expected to be almost 36-37% in FY22 on the back of an 11% earnings growth on the Nifty for FY21. So great news on the earnings side. However, the challenge is that the market appears to be cognizant of this. It has discounted this, and which is why when you look at the forward PE of the market, it is almost at record levels when you look at the entire period of valuations going all the way back to November 2011 till today. These are some of the highest valuations that we've seen. So yes, the growth outlook is fabulous in terms of the forecast, but what is also true is that valuations have become quite elevated. Moving on to the next slide, we can see the valuations on a price to book basis. On the left-hand side for the Nifty 50, same message, quite expensive. Good news on the right-hand side, because as earnings are going up, the Nifty 50 return on equity is also starting to climb back to a more reasonable level, and perhaps it could, based on what we are seeing, go above the 15-16% level by the time we get to the end of the year, which is certainly a positive outcome. On the next slide, we are looking at the price to book for the mid caps and small cap ratios. Nothing very new to say here. These two look a similar picture like the large caps. In both cases, the markets have now moved into expensive territory. Particularly the small caps, I would say, compared to their history, looking a lot more expensive. Some of this relates to the fact that a lot of new listings have happened of companies, which has pushed up this number in terms of valuations. But still, just compared to history, this is an expensive market, and therefore, we need to be cognizant of the risk from valuations. Moving on to the next slide, this gives you the context of where are we in terms of the comparison of equities and bonds. The historical yield gap is 1%. Today, the gap is closer to 180 basis points. So we are quite far away from the mean, which means that, yes, equities are rich relative to their history, as we saw on the previous slides. But what this slide is telling us is that compared to bonds, even though equities were still not looking very expensive, even I would say 3 months ago, today this is a picture which is giving us the same message, that compared to bonds, equities are in rich territory. So more or less a similar message here as well. Moving on to, sort of just concluding, economic activity is on a very strong recovery trajectory. I'm sure all of you or any of you who have traveled would have seen that, the airports are full, the airlines are running full, the malls are up to, full capacity. It's hard to get restaurant reservations in Mumbai. So economic activity is on a fairly strong recovery trajectory, and GST collections are a reflection of that. Record GST collections being reported in September. Inflation in India, slightly more sticky. Two things which give us some positive hope. One is that the cut in fuel duties will help reduce some of the inflationary pressure. Second, as I said in my earlier slides, remember some of the commodity prices are cooling off. Whether they go back to March 20 level is a separate debate, but as they cool off, it will give some relief on the inflation front. The MPC remains very, very supportive of growth, and they continue to highlight both the output gap, which means production in the economy is still well below full capacity, and weak credit growth as reasons to stay supportive. But there is no doubt that when the economy is in a strong recovery trajectory, there is no reason for policy settings to remain extremely accommodative, and therefore we do expect a series of steps from the MPC to start to move towards a more neutral position. The outlook for exports is very strong due to growth trends in the developed world. The good sort of platform we have today is that corporate balance sheets are extremely strong. Because of the strong profitability some of these companies have enjoyed, they have managed to deleverage. Interest rates are extremely low. Tax rates, we know, have come down dramatically, and all of this creates an enabling environment for people to consider investing in their businesses and in new capacities. The holdback is that, would you invest in new capacities when there is an output gap? So you're still not running at full capacity. When is it that entrepreneurs begin to feel the confidence that, yes, capacities are now likely to move towards full utilization, and therefore I need to build new capacity? So I think, but this is the strong news. The balance sheets, the low tax rates, the low interest rates, the fairly good fiscal health of the union government. The challenge is valuations. Because in equity markets, rich valuations, good news, good data points, good headlines go together. And in equity markets, we know from history, as we saw in March 20, cheap valuations, bad news, weak headlines, troubling data points tend to go together. And when you have elevated valuations, we need to be careful. We cannot interpret the last 1 year's return outcomes as the new normal for equity markets, because these elevated valuations potentially become a drag on the returns we can earn in the future. So that's the caveat, and that's the thing that we need to be careful about. So our message to investors would continue to be, stick to your asset allocation framework. This is not a time to get get more bullish on equities when valuations are rich. Stick to your systematic investing plans. Be there for investment or be there for withdrawal, because in both cases, through SIPs or SWPs, you can avoid the risks which are caused by volatility, and stick to your asset allocation framework in a disciplined manner at this point of time. So that's about my wrap for the markets and what we think about it at this point of time. I'm now going to invite my colleague and fund manager, Vishal, into the conversation, and he's going to talk about the strategies that he's involved with, which is the long-term equity fund and the children's funds. Over to you, Vishal.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Vetri. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Wishing you a very happy Diwali and a happy New Year to everyone. I'll be speaking today on UTI Long-Term Equity Fund, that is the ELSS fund, and the UTI Children's Career Fund, that's a solution-oriented fund for children. The reason I will be speaking for both the funds together is that essentially we follow a similar investment strategy for both the funds. The reason being, both the funds actually have a lock-in period for the investor. So that allows us as a fund manager to follow a very similar kind of investment thought process and an investment strategy. Can we move to the next slide? So, so coming to the investment strategy, and the first point, it flows actually from the UTI investment process. I mean, you would be familiar with the whole ROC and the cash flow framework we have, the focus on operating cash flow and return ratios. So this fund also follows that approach. The focus is on companies with very good cash flow generation, companies with healthy balance sheet. But on valuations, we follow a different approach. We look at valuations, and then we try to understand what does the current valuation imply in terms of long-term growth for that company. And if we believe that the company is reasonably placed to achieve that growth or even outpace that growth, we will look to invest in that company, even if the headline valuations might look expensive. So in this fund, it's broadly a blend approach. You will see growth stocks as well as value stocks. And in the growth stocks, you might find stocks which look expensive on PE basis, but we hold them because we feel, given their longevity of growth and the return ratios, the current valuations can be justified. The thing which we avoid basically is the balance sheet risk. So we are open to investing in some of the cyclical sectors and cyclical companies where we think the near-term cycle looks good and valuations adequately capture that cyclicality. But even in those cases, we strictly avoid companies in which there's an excessive leverage or there's a balance sheet risk. So we generally avoid those companies. And even in growth sectors, sometimes we have good quality companies facing through transitory issues on growth, which traditionally have been growing well and have been generating good cash flows. We are always on lookout of such companies where we believe the growth issues are transitory and valuations adequately capture that. We generally look to invest in those kind of companies. Coming to the earlier point when I mentioned that because both the children's fund and the tax fund have a lock-in period for the investors, so that allows us to have a slightly higher tilt towards small and mid cap space in both the strategies. So what we do is we generally try to cap the large cap exposure at around 65%, and the mid cap and small cap exposure is generally more than 35%. As we speak today, I think the large cap exposure in the funds is close to 60%, while the mid cap and small cap exposure is close to 40%. That's how the current split is, and that I think this will remain that way unless and until we found adequate opportunities on both sides. And lastly, just to balance out the risk from higher mid and small cap exposure, what the fund generally tries to do is not take any aggressive calls on any particular sector, and we generally try to generate alpha more by stock selection rather than sector selection. So we'll generally not find having a zero weight in any particular big sector. We'll try to find the best companies in that sector and we'll still try to have some weight in that sector. So just to manage the risk from a higher mid and small cap exposure, we'll balance it out by having a more less aggressive approach when it comes to sector selection. Can we move to the next slide? So very quickly on the, if you can see on the left hand side how the sectoral makeup of the fund is and what the active weight of the fund is. As you can see, we are the fund has exposure to all the sectors. We generally don't take an approach of having no exposure to any particular sector. Most sector weights are largely in line with the benchmark weight. That's the philosophy of the fund. There are few exceptions here, and that is largely because of how the benchmark is constructed rather than our conscious approach. So just to give you an example, it will look like we have a very large underweight in the oil and gas sector, but that is because we don't own Reliance Industries, which is the biggest stock in the sector. And as we know, Reliance has although it is classified as oil and gas company in benchmark, but we know that a large part of the value of the company actually comes from non-oil and gas sectors like telecom and retail. So what we have done is that we have taken exposure to companies in pure play companies in both telecom and retail sectors to have that exposure. That is why. So if you look at pure oil and gas weight and only attributing the weight the company has in oil and gas sector, we are not actually really this underweight. Similarly, you look at consumer services, which looks a big overweight. Again, that is because we own other retail stocks, because we can't own Reliance Retail, which is unlisted. So that is how the sector weights, some of the sector weights have become actually underweight and overweight. Otherwise, we generally follow an approach of having a less aggressive approach when it comes to sector selection. On the top 3-4 sectors, just I highlight our views, how I've been thinking and how I've been positioned in the fund. In financial sector, we are generally overweight in the private sector banks and underweight in the public sector banks. If you look at our portfolio, we only have SBI, which is a public sector bank, because that SBI has managed its credit costs reasonably well in last couple of years. They have done the outcomes actually have been very comparable to even private sector banks. Otherwise, as a philosophy, we are more overweight on private sector banks and NBFCs, where we remain confident of the liability franchise and asset quality. And that is the consistent approach we continue to have. We also have exposure to some of the non-lending businesses like general insurance and life insurance in the space. In the consumer goods sector, we have always been overweight on consumer discretionary and underweight on consumer staples. By consumer discretionary, I mean the retail sector, the consumer durable sector. And we have seen that their growth outcomes have generally been in the past have been much better, superior compared to consumer staples. This is largely because they are significantly underpenetrated as compared to most of the staple categories. And going ahead, we expect that discretionary will continue to outperform staples when it comes to growth, as the penetration level still continues to remain very low. The other sector big sector we have IT, which has done quite well in last 1 year. I think the sector is seeing strong growth momentum, which could continue for some more time as companies across the globe, across sectors, are investing in digital technologies. Companies have seen what happened when lockdown happened. A couple of lockdowns happened in last 2 years. Consumers have to order everything from home. All the processes, employees are working from home. So most companies who are not tech enabled or digitally enabled are spending on to become more digital, and that business is coming to the IT services companies. Automobile is the other sector we have, and this is one sector where valuations still remain good, as the sector has seen a large impact. Even before COVID, there was a cyclical slowdown in the sector, also accentuated by a lot of technology transitions, which led to higher costs to the consumer. And obviously, post-COVID, there was another slowdown. We already started seeing some bit of recovery, but unfortunately, the sector has again got impacted because of the whole semiconductor shortage, which Vetri also spoke about. But underlying demand momentum actually looks decent, especially in the passenger vehicle side. And whenever in next few quarters the supply chain issues get resolved, we think the sector is bound for revival, as the sector has seen almost 3-4 bad years now. Can we move to next slide?
Yeah, thanks, Vishal. In fact, thanks for the rundown on the fund and the strategy. So beforehand, in fact, we have received a few questions. So we thought we can post it here, so for the benefit of all. So I'll read the question for you, so you can answer. The first question is, it seems like the festive season started on a strong note with a record retail sales. So is this sustainable?
Yeah, actually, part of the question, already got answered when Vetri spoke in the beginning about how especially the salaried class and the people in the urban cities had lot of savings as they couldn't, lot of avenues to spend did not happen in last 18 months. So there was so I would say, is this sustainable? It's a very difficult thing to say, because obviously part of the record sales we are seeing is also pent up. Lot of, I mean, if you look at numbers and results of lot of, especially apparel companies, footwear companies, you have seen that they had a very bad 5-6 quarters where consumers were not coming to shop. So consumers obviously had not bought apparel and footwear, and even jewelry to an extent. Now with the wedding season opening up and general pent up demand, all those sectors are seeing very good demand. On the contrary, you have seen something like consumer durables, which actually had a very good year last year itself, when people were stuck at home. So you had a lot of sales of refrigerators, washing machines, televisions, laptops. And so there is no pent up in those sectors this year, as a lot of pent up actually happened last year itself. And there, the demand is not bad, but obviously as not as strong as some of the other sectors. So I would say part of it is pent up, so that will go off. But part of it is also sustainable, which is the normal double-digit growth. I think most of these sectors we should continue to expect.
Sure, thank you. So we will take the next question. The second question goes like this. The fund with approximately 6% exposure in consumer services sector is overweight by 4% over the benchmark. So with continued stress on supply, what are the trends that you are closely watching, and what are the key drivers for the sector's growth?
So in the consumer services sector, when you look at the sectoral classification given by IISL, NSE, so consumer services actually largely is the retail sector, which will include apparel, retail, jewelry, QSR, restaurants, and even some of the internet companies like a Zomato or a Info Edge or Naukri. So all these become part of consumer services. Part of the overweight is explained by the fact, as I was saying, that we don't own Reliance, which also has a big presence in the retail sector. And to compensate for that, we have exposure to a lot of retail companies like Jubilant FoodWorks, DMart, Aditya Birla Fashion and Retail. So, and we also participated in some of the internet IPOs which recently came. So part of it is because of that, and part of it is also because since we participated in those internet IPOs which are currently not part of benchmark, but obviously they have a very high market cap and subsequently they will become part of benchmark. So I think this overweight will get reduced automatically. To that extent, we participated because fundamentally bottom up we like the story, and I think because of the sheer market cap they could become part of benchmark. On the supply chain issue, I think this sector, apart from the consumer durable sector, which is facing some issue, I don't think this sector is facing such a big supply chain issue. The supply chain issue is much bigger in the automobile sector and not in the consumer services sector. In terms of trends, which we are clearly watching, basically, I mean, this is similar to the last question I answered. The continuous monitoring obviously has been that how much of the demand has been sustainable. What has happened as that demand has and the numbers have clearly surprised us, at least in the near term. So what I will tend to believe is that earlier the expectation was that most of these brick and mortar retail companies could see returning back to normalcy, say sometime next year, FY23. But what has happened, I think, is the normalcy has come much sooner, as the wave 3 did not come and people have become much more confident with vaccination. So the normalcy has returned much sooner. So in the near term, there's a positive surprise, but I don't think that changes anything from a longer term point of view. 2 years out, if we were expecting certain revenue from these companies, I think that will continue to remain. So it's just that the recovery has come much sooner in some of these companies. And last point I will make is that for most of these companies, they are significantly exposed to actually urban markets and not in rural. So obviously how the urban India does is very important for most of these consumer discretionary companies, as a lot of FMCG companies have much larger exposure to rural India. So that is obviously one key thing which is to be watched out when you look at consumer discretionary or consumer services companies.
Thanks, Vishal. Yeah, before we move on to take a few online questions, we have one question to Vetri here. Vetri, this is a question for you. Given that equity valuation is in elevated trajectory, can investors look at taking tactical allocation in any thematic or sector funds today? If yes, which are the favorable options for your consideration?
Sure. Thanks, Niranjan. That's an interesting question. So first, let me just step back and say, the purpose of having sector or thematic funds is to really use them as toppings on part of your portfolio, and they are meant to be tactical in nature. These are not the core part of your portfolio where you are doing a long-term systematic investment plan, where you are thinking about participating in the wealth that gets created in the market over 10 years and 20 years. These are opportunities where when we use the word tactical, we are looking at making an entry when we think the circumstances and valuations are favorable, and simultaneously thinking about it in terms of taking that money off the table when the valuations become fuller or our return expectations are achieved. So that is the way we would always look at investing in sector or thematic funds. Now, when we look at the sector or thematic fund landscape today, I would say the one which actually stands out, and we've talked about this earlier, is the automobile and transportation sector. Reason being that when you look at this particular sector, actually the volumes in this sector are running much below the volumes that they had in 2019 financial year. So for almost 3 years, they have faced a variety of challenges due to which volumes have been much lower. And therefore, there is good reason for us to believe that given the underpenetration of automobile ownership in the country, there is scope for the growth rates to revive and for volumes to go back towards the historical levels that we saw almost 3 years ago. And therefore, as a result, this is one sector where we think the equation in terms of valuations and in terms of mean reversion in growth is favorably placed. Another sector where we think there is an opportunity is in the entire pharmaceutical and healthcare space. Here, I would say the valuation story is more mid-range because there was a valuation recovery which happened in this domestic healthcare and also the pharmaceutical space sometime in the middle of 2020. So valuations are more mid-cycle, but we think the long-term structural growth opportunity both in the domestic market as well as the position of Indian companies as being among the leading low-cost manufacturing destinations or rather origins for global pharmaceutical requirements of drugs. So I think auto would really be the standout in terms of being out of favor, valuation supportive, and mean reversion and growth, followed by the healthcare funds. These are the two places where we see the opportunities based on, as I said, an entry and a potential exit at some point of time.
Sure. Thanks, Vijay. So now we will move on to take the online questions which have come our way. The first question is coming from Mr. Radhakrishna Saha. The question goes like this: the 10-year US bond yields, after scaling record highs recently last month, have started to trend lower. So as FOMC, the central bank in US, has started given strong hints on tapering, which is the quantitative easing to come soon. So will there be a taper tantrum similar to the one in 2013? Also, what is the potential impact on equities, particularly the domestic markets?
So very quickly, let me just highlight that actually the peak for the US 10-year bond yield came in the first quarter of the current calendar year. Ever since then, actually, despite visible improvements in the growth trajectory of the economy, actually the 10-year bond yield has come down rather than go up. That's point number one. Having said that, there has been an increase in the shorter end of the yield curve in the US, particularly in the rates up to 2 years, which is more indicative of what the market believes is likely. Not likely, the telegraphed gradual reduction of large-scale asset purchases by the Federal Reserve, or rather a gradual withdrawal of quantitative easing as it's commonly referred to, and the potential sometime in late 22 for interest rate hikes in the US. So I would say that's the first part of the answer. Second part, is there risk of a taper tantrum? I would just say very quickly, two things have changed. Ever since the taper tantrum, particularly the US Federal Reserve has been more cautious about telegraphing well in advance what its thought process is, so that it prepares the market for certain course of action rather than surprise it unnecessarily. So to my mind, to that extent, they are continuing to telegraph well in advance. They are following that script. The risk is limited. Particularly from India's point of view, I think the risk is now very different this point of time, simply because when the taper tantrum happened in 2013, India had record high inflation. India had a current account deficit which was close to almost 5%. The trade deficit was in excess of 10%. Currently, we have record foreign exchange surpluses, inflation well within the comfort band of the central bank, and finally, the current account, remember, was actually in surplus till 2 quarters back. Even now, based on the run rate, it is unlikely to be more than 1.5 or maybe at best 2%. And the trade deficit is, very well contained. In fact, we are going to have a record year in terms of exports. So the initial conditions which created the crisis of 2013 in India, high inflation, low foreign exchange reserves relative to imports, high current account deficit, high trade deficit, none of these reasons exist. Can there be some tremors? Certainly, if something unexpected happens, but the initial conditions for a repeat of the taper tantrum in India do not appear to exist.
Thanks, Vetri. There is one question coming from Mr. Sudhir Kumar, which is on the basically the coal mines. So India's captive coal mines to be allowed to sell like 50% of their annual output in the open market. So what will be the impact on companies having captive mines and impact on electricity producing companies in the current and the coming fiscal?
So, I can't really comment on specific companies. See, the Indian government has been gradually adopting multiple policies to sort of enable companies who are in the coal mining space to sell their output, excess output, if they are not able to use it, to other companies. They have even opened up coal to merchant mining, where the private sector is now welcome to enter. So I think some of these on balance will have, a better utilization of India's available coal resources. But actually, I would say the biggest challenge to the utilization of India's coal resources is the commitments that we have now made, both in the Paris 2015 Accord, as well as in the recent Copenhagen Summit, COP26 as it is known, where India has not only set a net zero target of 2070, which is of course very distant and away in the future, but also made significant commitments regarding 2030, by when we have committed that 50% of our capacity will come from renewable sources. Remember, we are a country who is hugely dependent on fossil fuels for our energy needs. So I think this is really the dramatic shift which is happening in front of our eyes in terms of how the energy landscape is likely to pan out over the next decade. It's not a 2070 target. This target was given by the Prime Minister for 2030. So really the challenge is twofold. One, can companies actually increase the production of coal in a short period of time? Secondly, how many buyers will be there for coal in a short period of time? Because remember, everybody is trying to pivot away from coal, whether it is steel companies, whether it is cement companies. All of them are looking at ways to pivot away from using coal in their manufacturing process. And we know for a fact, we can see it in the data, nobody is planning new coal-based power plants. Everybody, including the country's largest generator, is looking to invest only in renewables going ahead. So I think the structural equation is still not favorable for coal at this point of time.
So thanks, Vetri. So we will move on to the next question. This time, this is a question to Vishal. Vishal, the question goes like this. Given that there is a sluggish credit growth on YOY basis, what will be the impact on quantum of margins from corporate and retail advances? Also, what are the expected drivers of growth for banks, particularly the PSU and NBFC going forward? This is a question coming from Mr. Sunil.
Okay. So actually, if you look at the bank results also this quarter, and there's a point which Vetri also alluded to earlier, that the capacity utilization levels remain quite low in the economy. So in that context, I think corporate advances or credit growth from corporate side because of capex cycle recovery will remain low. Whatever it comes will be largely because of the working capital loans, and obviously we continue to see some bit of capex in some of the sectors, which is the normal capex. But big capex cycle, considering the utilization levels remain low, so the credit growth from corporate side will be might remain muted relative to on the retail side. On the retail side, we are seeing after some slowdown in credit growth during the pandemic period, it improving, and it is being led by again personal loans, credit cards, and also you are seeing some kind of revival starting on the housing side, on the residential real estate side. So you will have mortgages, credit cards, personal loans continue to see growth. The other big sector which we again spoke about on this call in last half an hour is on the auto side. So as the auto cycle recovers, both on passenger vehicles and commercial vehicles, I think that side of the growth could also improve. So obviously, not specifically any PSU or any bank or any NBFCs, but obviously lenders which have exposure to retail side or to the auto side could see a growth improving for them on the AUM growth side.
Sure. Thanks, Vishal. Patrick, there is one question on IPOs. So question is coming from Bhagirathi Pradhan and Shweta Ghosh, who is connected online. So there is a huge market for IPOs in the recent months. So what is the fund house approach to participate in IPOs? And also, is there a contrarian view to crowd sentiment in any pockets or sectors?
So, I don't think we would like to start our approach to investing on the basis that we must be contrarian and do the opposite. This is an interesting time in the marketplace where many new companies, and when I say new companies, these are actually completely new business models in many cases which are coming to the market. And we'll have to see how these business models evolve, how they play out over time. But from our point of view, some of these do look like they can potentially have a very strong growth opportunity because of the uniqueness of the way they have created their business models. So we have been quite selective. We tend to be quite selective in terms of the IPOs in which we participate. That's visible in our pattern of investing in IPOs, where we believe that some of these businesses have a interesting long-term future. We have taken the initial step of, sort of getting our feet wet by stepping in and buying a small position in the fund. We'll continue to monitor these investments. Our own understanding of these companies will evolve. These business models are also evolving rather rapidly. But I think what we never lose sight of is the fundamental pillars of our investing process, which is that eventually these companies should be capable of generating their own strong operating cash flows and certainly enough cash flows to fund their investment needs such that they're able to invest that capital at a high rate of return in terms of their return on capital. So I think those two fundamental pillars continue to underpin our investing approach when it comes to evaluating these IPOs. I'm sure our own understanding, as I said, will evolve. And that is why even in the cases where we've participated in some of them, we've actually been slow and steady rather than taking big bets. I also just want to make one broad point, and I think this is my own experience over many years. It's not that when IPOs come to the market, that is the only time you will be able to buy the company to be able to make money. I still remember, a company like Infosys came to the market in 1993, right? So what if you didn't buy it in the IPO? You could have bought it in 96, 97, 98 and still made tons of money. In fact, you could have even bought it in 2003 and made a lot of money out of it. So really, you learn more about a business as it stays listed, as you engage with management, as you understand the strength of the business model, and there will be enough time to make money out of it. So we don't look at IPOs as, we have to participate because if we don't participate now, we'll lose out for the next 20 years. Nothing like that is going to happen. We just want to, where we think the evidence favors and our pillars tell us that these are business models which can generate cash flow and high ROC, get our feet wet, and then gradually we can decide how we want to build up.
Thanks, Vetri. That reinforces a lot on our investment framework that we follow. There is one question on the mid and small cap. Vishal can actually take this. Vishal, the fund has an exposure to mid and small cap to the extent of around 40%. So given that the aggregate valuation are looking expensive, so what's your approach to mid and small cap at the current juncture? So this is a question coming from Mr. Debashish Dasgupta.
Okay, thanks for the question. So, I mean, be it mid caps or be it small caps or large caps, actually, the approach is being very stock selective, so stock specific. So we don't take a, I mean, broad brush approach that we have to increase exposure to mid and small cap. So it's always being a very stock specific approach, and we continue to do so. So as you rightly pointed out, and as we saw in the few of the slides earlier, the aggregate mid and small cap valuations have actually gone on the expensive side. So we continue to monitor and evaluate the holdings which we have in the fund, and where required, we even take profit booking if required. And on new investment side, also we are very cognizant of the valuations where we are entering. So we are being very selective. I don't think we can take a broad brush approach that mid and small caps have become expensive, or so we should reduce the weight or we should increase the weight. It's again a very stock specific approach.
Sure, Vishal. Thanks. There is another question to you. There is a significant rise in FDI flows into digital sector. So with PE and VC investment estimated at nearly $30 US billion. So in the coming in, particularly in the first of the year. So what is driving the sector's growth, and how is this segment played in your portfolio?
So actually, it comes back to the question of IPOs. We are having actually, and we continue to have a lot of IPOs from the digital or the internet sector, and on the private market side also, we continue to see a lot of investments or a lot of money coming in those kind of companies, which might eventually come for IPOs in next few years. So I mean, what the last 2 years have clearly shown that the digital companies or the internet enabled companies have been able to grab market share from the traditional channels and the traditional companies. And the expectation is that if not at the same pace as last couple of years, slowly and steadily across most sectors and segments, the share of online will keep on rising compared to the share of brick and mortar retailing. I think that is driving the whole growth in the sectors. And as long as that shift continues to happen across categories, and most of these internet companies have large market shares in their respective categories, they will continue to see very good growth, which is also reflecting in the valuations which they are garnering both in the public and private markets. Here, our approach is very simple. And because they are again largely IPOs, as Vetri mentioned, we are being very selective in choosing which IPOs to participate in or which digital or internet companies to participate in. Apart from the growth which they are showing, we also look at unit economics, and positive unit economics will enable them to eventually generate cash flow which can fund their own growth.
Thanks, Vishal. One question again back to Vetri. Again, this time it is on the thematic fund. Vetri, the question is on this time dividend yielding companies. So with high dividend yielding companies, so generally these companies do come with high cash flow in nature as well, right? And particularly they have done well over the last 1 year period. So, however, the dividend yield as a theme seems to like they have started to lag behind the large cap funds. So how does the dividend yield as a theme is making sense today? And secondly, if you can throw some light on the infrastructure as a theme. This is a question which is coming from Mr. Kamal.
Sure. Very quickly on the dividend yield fund, I mean, those of you who've heard me speak on this or more likely have heard Swati, who has been helming, dividend yield for a long time as fund manager. We have never looked at dividend yield fund as purely a play on a high dividend. What we want are businesses that can not only pay a reasonable dividend, not necessarily highest dividend, but can then continue to grow that dividend over time. Now, what do you have to do to grow dividend over time? You have to be able to grow your business as well. So when you look at our dividend yield portfolio, you will find over there that it is a mix of companies which pay a reasonable yield along with companies where there is potential for growth and dividends over many, many years because their business models have perhaps already demonstrated that. And finally, there is a small component where we are looking for perhaps significant improvement in profitability of the company, maybe for cyclical reasons, and therefore there's an opportunity to participate in normalization of that dividend yield. So that is the way we run the portfolio. I would say the portfolio tend to has therefore a little bit of a value-oriented blend when you look at the aggregate portfolio, but it is broadly diversified across sectors because those growth in dividend names pop up, away from the traditional value sectors. And it's a strategy which has actually been very steady and consistent over a long period of time. So don't look at it as something which is cyclical just to participate in a market move. Our sort of balanced approach has actually done well over time as a dividend yield strategy, and I think it's one of the largest such funds in its category, and has you can of course look at the performance data, but I think it's been stewarded extremely well. I think the other question was about the infrastructure fund. Yeah, so let me just put it this way. I think most times when I'm asked about infrastructure, my answer tends to be the same. There are two challenges when you think about infrastructure. One, the big boom in infrastructure in India happened going back more than a decade, when it was built on the back of what we call the public-private partnership model. That model is now dead and gone. It's forgotten. It doesn't exist. It's unlikely to come back in a hurry. Government is now actually moving towards selling finished assets for income stream and then taking on the onus of doing capex itself. Having said that, there are limitations. What are the limitations? As much as the union government talks about doing capex, the reality is that the union government accounts for only 40% of total capex in the country. And out of that, once you exclude defense capex, the size of union government capex in the entire government capex is actually much smaller. So ability of government to drive capex is also limited, and governments have continued to do capex, but the state governments in totality, in aggregate, are more important than the union government. So from our point of view, we don't see a return to the classic infrastructure theme the way that we understood it 10, 15 years ago. Can there be an increase in overall industrial activity? As we see capacity utilization go up, some industrial investment happening, perhaps some investment starting to happen in new areas, renewable energy, biofuels, hydrogen. Will there be some companies that can participate in that? Yes, potentially. So there is a possibility of benefiting from a pickup in industrial investment, but I would look at that as very distinct from infrastructure the way it was understood a decade ago.
Thanks, Vetri. So we have already hit the scheduled time, but I'll take one last question, which is coming from Mr. Glenn Morgan. So this is on rupee versus dollar. So what is your outlook on the strength of rupee over dollar over the next few years?
So, we are not currency experts, so we don't try and forecast what the currency will do. But let me just put it in context. I think Indian inflation running at about, let's say, 5.5%. US inflation, long-term target, 2.5%. Remember, India's target is actually 4% plus or minus 2%. So the CPI differential is now more like 2.5 to 3%. As compared to the historical gap. When I started my career, this gap we used to think about as 6% and 7% gap. That gap is now down to 2.5, 3%. My sense is that's the sort of rate one should work at, in terms that perhaps if we look over the next 3 to 5 years, the annualized depreciation in the rupee should be about 2.5 to 3% per annum. Could be even, it could be in that range of 2 to 3% per annum. Short term, I don't see any significant volatility, simply because of some of the factors I talked earlier. Record foreign exchange reserves, and you have got a situation where your current account balance and trade balance is looking in very good shape. So can't see any reason for panic on that front.
So yeah, obviously we could not take many questions which had come here. So I request participants to be in touch with our office or the relationship manager, who will be more than happy to help you on your queries. So with that, back to you, Vetri, for the closing.
Sure. Thank you so much, Niranjan, for being a gracious host today, and thank you, Vishal, for joining us here and talking about the strategies. And thank you to all of you viewers who registered and have come online to listen to us. I hope we were able to throw some light on some things that we found to be interesting data points, as well as our thoughts on markets, sectors, and the way to go about investing. Once again, we are in the run-up to the end of the year, so I'd like to continue to wish all of you a happy festival season. And of course, we'll be talking in December before we get to the year end. But just two pieces of housekeeping. One, I hope all of you participated in the poll. I was supposed to remind you all to keep participating during the session, but it was so engrossing that I forgot to do that reminders. But hopefully, we'll get that more active next time. Also, on November 15th, we have the next edition of the UTI Symposia, and I think a link for that will perhaps be available on the screen, or it might have come to you by email. Do register and attend that event. We have two wonderful speakers lined up. Rujita Divekar, sort of the doyen of good health and good eating, and also Ayesha Khanna, who is an expert on artificial intelligence and how that's revolutionizing the world around us. So look forward to your participation in UTI Symposia. Look out and register for that event. Thank you once again for your time today, and have a good evening.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.